Howdy, and a great morning to everyone. My name is Michael Anthony DiMiranda, and I serve you as the Dean of the School of Education and Human Development at Texas A&M University. I would like to thank you this morning for the privilege of your presence, whether you are here or the many watching via live stream across the nation and around the world. Welcome to the Dean's Distinguished Lecture, which will address the challenges of teacher education, including tensions and trends. The problem in question today is the challenge of providing each of our nation's youth with an ample supply of teachers who are caring, confident, competent, and capable to educate each and every one of them to their fullest potential. The problem that I speak of today, and that we will hear across a set of series of lectures this day, is ongoing. It is not just here in the great state of Texas, but around the United States and indeed around the world. And it affects all of us. It affects not only our nation, business, industry, but those who are intimately entrusted to address this problem, our educators, our administrative leaders, our students, and our parents. The problem is also top of mind of our school's faculty and staff, where we are prepared to address this challenge as we prepare the next generation of educators and administrative leaders of tomorrow. Joining us to address this problem and what can be done about it is a renowned scholar and practitioner with more than 4 decades of exemplary experience. I speak of Dr. Marilyn Cochran-Smith, who will be joining us today, and later this evening, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. Dr. Cochran-Smith is known nationally and internationally for her scholarship in teacher education research, practice, and policy. She is a member of the National Academy of Education and serves currently as the Croft-Thorne Professor of Teacher Education and Urban Schools in the Lynch School of Education at Boston College. Dr. Cochran-Smith is also a nationally recognized author of books, scholarly chapters, journal articles, and editorials focused on teacher education, social justice, and areas of national concern. Dr. Cochran-Smith has previously served as the president of the American Education Research Association, known as AERA. Following Dr. Cochran-Smith's lecture, she will be happy to answer your questions regarding this topic and her presentation. Those of you in our live audience can ask questions by going up to the microphone in the center aisle of our venue today. At this time, out of respect and courtesy, I would like for each of those here in attendance to please take your beloved device in your hand, and if you could please place it in the courteous theater or silence mode for the duration of this event. Once again, it is my absolute distinct privilege not only to welcome you, the family of Texas A&M University, but to join me in welcoming Dr. Marilyn Cochran-Smith. Marilyn?
Good morning. And good morning to all those who are on live stream out there somewhere in cyberspace. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for the honor of presenting the Dean's Distinguished Lecture here at the School of Education and Human Development at Texas A&M. I want to say a very special thank you to Dean DeMiranda, to Associate Dean Zhang, and to Professor Craig. All three of those people played central roles in planning this visit. So thank you very much for your gracious welcome. As you can see, I'm going to be using a few abbreviations: TE for teacher education, TC for teacher candidate, TQ for teacher quality. And I also want to make a note about references. I am going to refer to a number of things during the talk, and we've arranged to have those references in the full mode with all the information available to you with a QR code that they can get somewhere, right? You'll make that known to them. So you'll be able to have all the information about the references. So as a preview, and I am going to have to look to see if we are on the same page, so to speak. As a preview, I'm going to be talking about three questions today. First, how has the problem of teacher education historically been constructed in the US over pretty much the last century? Second, if justice and equity are our objectives, how should we be constructing the problem of teacher education now in the 2020s? And then third, what does it look like in various contexts to construct teacher education as an equity problem? When I asked Dean DeMiranda what he had in mind for this event, he gave me a lot of helpful information. And then he said he hoped the lecture might be inspirational. So I hope so too, but I want to warn you in advance that my talk is not 100% inspirational. The focus of the first question is history, some of which is downright depressing, so perhaps not inspirational. With the second question, my hope is to provide inspiration about the ways we think about equity and the ways we might think about it differently. Then building on this, the third question features contemporary examples of powerful, equity-centered teacher education. And I think, and I hope, that some of these examples will resonate with and affirm work that you may already be doing. Some may suggest provocative questions for you to think about, and perhaps some will even inspire new projects and possibilities. So my hope is to move from history to insight and then to wind up with inspiration. So let me start with question one. How has the problem of teacher education historically been constructed in the US over the last century? Now, I'm going to start with a few lines you probably know, and if you're like me, you probably hate. Those who can do, those who can't teach. Now, those lines go on, you may or may not know. Those who can't teach, teach teachers. Those who can't teach teachers do research. Those who can't do research teach research. Now, the first time I heard this whole thing, I sort of liked those last two lines because they sort of spread the blame around a little bit and basically insulted everybody who worked at universities and colleges, not just those people who were involved in teacher education. But when you think about it for a minute, it's really not so funny. The second line, those who can't teach, and the last line, those who can't do research, teach research, reflect the long history of denigrating teachers and the activity of teaching. The third line throws in a special insult for the whole enterprise of teacher education. The references to the last two lines to research initially seemed to me like a pretty good joke. And this was partly because my husband is a professor of research methods. But when you look at it again, you realize that the last two lines have much less to do with research than with teaching. So at the end of the day, even the last two lines also denigrate the value of teacher education and teaching. I still see some parts of these lines occasionally in the media, you may too. Sometimes you hear a little bit of this from politicians who are aiming to rally sentiment against teachers and what they're supposedly not teaching, or what they're supposedly not learning in teacher education programs. The fact that some of these lines are still familiar, well over 100 years after George Bernard Shaw wrote them, suggests, I think, that teaching and teacher education in the US have an image problem. They've long been considered by some members of the public and some policymakers as problems. So I want to take a brief look at this problem of teacher education, beginning with the 1930s and then continuing until the present day. So almost 100 years. And two caveats here. I'm using very rough timeframes. So I'm going to say some dates, but you'll see that little squiggle that indicates approximately. And I'm only really considering mainstream constructions of the problem of teacher education. I'm not trying to be comprehensive or inclusive of all histories or multiple histories, such as the history of education and teacher education for Black communities, so elegantly analyzed by scholars like James Anderson and Vanessa Siddle Walker. So I want to acknowledge that's not what I'm going to do in this very short presentation of the history. So what I want to suggest is that there have been four dominant constructions of the problem of teacher education. Teacher education as a curriculum problem, teacher education as a training problem, as a learning problem, and as a policy problem. Between the 1930s and 60s, the problem of teacher education was constructed as a curriculum problem. Now, I'm calling it a curriculum problem because it had to do with how many and what kinds of courses and educational experiences teachers should have. And it also had to do with where and how prospective teachers should study. In 1956, educational historian Merle Barrowman captured this debate in his book, which was actually called The Liberal and the Technical in Teacher Education. In broad strokes, he sorted out the opposing claims of those who believed teacher education should focus primarily on the liberal, in short, what prospective teachers should know and learn so that they could teach in the tradition of the liberal arts, versus those who believed that teacher education should focus primarily on the technical, in short, how to teach. As part of the debate, both the normal schools of the day and the emerging scholarly field of education were often accused of narrowly focusing on the banalities of the technical, while ignoring the more liberal, intellectual, and moral aspects of teacher development. There were many calls for reform during this time, including at least some recognition that teachers probably needed to learn both how to teach and what to teach. But as we'll see, the dichotomy of the liberal and the technical emerged again and again, and you may be thinking of examples of it right now. At any rate, by the 1960s, two important things had happened. Virtually every state required teachers to have at least a college degree. And nearly all state teachers' colleges, many that had started out as normal schools, had become multi-purpose colleges and then eventually regional universities. This brings us to a second construction of the problem of teacher education as a training problem. This was dominant from roughly the 60s to the early 80s. During this time, teacher effectiveness studies and the teacher competency movement were major trends. researchers were trying to correlate particular observed teacher behaviors with students' end-of-year test scores. Known as process product research, the ultimate intention was to develop what Nate Gage called the scientific basis of the art of teaching. I've always thought that was one of the better attempts to get both ideas in there, so you couldn't be blamed by either side. With teacher education, the point was to figure out the most efficient and effective techniques for training teacher candidates to engage in classroom behaviors that research had supposedly already proven would boost students' achievement. So there were studies of specific training procedures, and some of you might remember these depending on your age. So there were studies of things like micro-teaching, interaction analysis, behavior modification, lecture, demonstration. There were studies of whether student teachers exhibited more desired classroom behaviors after they watched videotapes of model classrooms versus after they went live and in person and observed in model classrooms. And there were even experiments where student teachers received real-time feedback about their behavior through transistorized audio receivers that were hidden in their ears, which were sent by supervisors sitting behind one-way mirrors. Of course, there were critiques of the training approach, especially there was strong criticism of the view that teaching and teacher education were treated as technical transmission activities, and of the fact that there was little attention to culture, context, difference, or the intellectual and relational aspects of teaching and teacher education. Things had changed a lot by the 1980s. Instead of focusing on teacher training, people talked primarily about teacher learning, and teacher education was constructed as a learning problem. Emphasis shifted away from what teacher candidates could do to what they knew and how they learned. At the heart of this construction of the problem of teacher education was the desire to enhance teacher quality by building a common knowledge base that would professionalize teacher education. The underlying premise here was that good teachers needed multiple kinds of knowledge. As Lee Schulman and others argued, they needed knowledge of learners and learning, of subject matter, of general pedagogy, as well as pedagogical content knowledge, knowledge of classroom interactions, knowledge of the context of schools, and knowledge to support a multicultural curriculum. With teacher education constructed as a learning problem, there was also a lot of attention to teacher candidates' dispositions, beliefs, attitudes, and values. Now, over time, there was plenty of criticism of teacher education as a learning problem, including that it focused too much on attitudes and values and not enough on practice. There was criticism that it didn't challenge the status quo, that it was implicitly centered on mainstream ways of knowing and teaching, and that it paid inadequate attention to diversity, social change, and equity. By the late 1990s, teacher education was being constructed as what I've called a policy problem, and market-based reform was central. Based on the assumption that teacher quality determined a nation's capacity to compete, the goal of teacher education as a policy problem was to identify which of the broad aspects of teacher education that could be controlled and manipulated by policymakers, things like how long programs were, who the providers were, which of those was most likely to boost teacher quality, which would presumably boost student achievement, which would presumably boost ability to compete in the global society. With unprecedented attention to teacher education at the highest levels of government, two policy tools became dominant during this time. One was deregulation. And again, many of you have lived through this, so you remember this very well. Deregulation policies aimed to break up the university monopoly on teacher preparation, enhance teachers' academic qualifications, and fill shortages. Fast track and alternate routes were supported by corporate and philanthropic sponsors, by foundations, and by the U.S. Secretary of Education. By the end of the 2010s, all but 2 U.S. states allowed, and some privileged, alternate routes into teaching. The second policy tool for solving teacher education as a policy problem was intensified accountability. This was reflected in the 1998 Title II reporting requirements that affected every teacher education program in the country. It was reflected in new professional and state accreditation standards. It was reflected in new teacher performance assessments, new teacher tests in many states required for licensure, and new consumer report cards that graded teacher education programs nationwide and widely disseminated their grades. Teacher education was treated as a policy problem from the 1990s through the 2010s. And although there was a shift during the 2010s toward more state-level policy, teacher education continues to be treated as a policy problem in many ways. Of course, there have been major critiques of teacher education constructed as a policy problem. Critics said the market focus of teacher education and teacher quality policies were narrow and centered on test-based outcomes that were deficit-focused. They said there was little recognition of the causes of inequity, and they pointed out that values related to democratic education and social justice were marginalized. So you just heard about 100 years of the problem of teacher education. That was very much a whirlwind tour. As I said, very brief, incomplete, and not comprehensive, but hopefully it gives you some suggestion of what big trends and big shifts were over that period of time. So this brings us to the 2020s. So as we know, by the 2020s, American society had become dramatically polarized, politically, ideologically, and in everyday social life. Income inequality and the racial wealth gap had risen to all-time highs. Widespread disparities continued in access to quality education, healthcare, jobs, transportation, early childhood services, food security, public safety. Digital disinformation and misinformation, including dangerous conspiracy theories, were everywhere. There were rising levels of adolescent mental health issues. The schools, teachers' work, teacher preparation, and teaching materials were incredibly politicized. By 2020, the field of teacher preparation was crowded and fragmented, with some places, including Texas, I think, preparing large numbers of new teachers through fast track, online, or non-university routes, some of which have been shown to be highly questionable. Meanwhile, teacher shortages were growing in many areas. In the midst of all this came the twin crises of spring 2020. As all of us know, in March of 2020, the global pandemic redefined many aspects of our lives. It closed down in-person K-12 and higher education, exacerbating existing societal and educational inequities while creating many new inequities and further politicizing health and safety issues. In May of 2020, the murder of George Floyd by the police was captured on video and widely disseminated, which, as part of ongoing movements, sparked massive Black Lives Matter protest. altered the way many white people thought about policing, and prompted sharply renewed reckonings regarding centuries of structural and systemic racism in US social, political, economic, and educational institutions, including teacher education. In some ways, the extraordinarily complex context in which teacher education is located now in the early 2020s is unique, educationally, socially, and politically. In other ways, it reflects a continuation of many persistent questions about the problem of teacher education and many long-term patterns of inequity and inequality in education and in society. It's within this context that I pose question 2. If justice and equity are our objectives, how should we be constructing the problem of teacher education for the 2020s? Now, I'm going to argue for a particular answer to this question, but first I want to explain why I've worded the question this way. First, in the early 2000s, Sonia Nieto titled an article in the Journal of Teacher Education, "Placing Equity Front and Center, Some Thoughts on Transforming Teacher Education for a New Century." She argued that although there was more and more emphasis in the schools and in teacher education on multicultural education, most of it, quote, avoided asking difficult questions related to access, equity, and social justice. Second, in 2006, Joyce King pointed to the devastating legacy of what she called white supremacy thinking in all aspects of education in a chapter about what it would mean and what it would take to achieve the full potential of Brown v. Board of Education more than 50 years after the original ruling. Her chapter asked, quote, "If justice is our objective, how can we educate for true human freedom?" And third, recently, I reviewed dozens of teacher education program websites from across the country because I wanted to see what they said about equity and justice. In truth, it was difficult to find teacher preparation websites that did not claim to have equity or justice as one of their goals. But I also found that these words were often used as a kind of catch-all term, vaguely connected to diversity or inclusion or closing gaps for minoritized groups. But the terms were seldom defined or theorized. Sometimes websites would say, "Equity and justice are our major goals" on the first slide, and then never return to those ideas in any of the rest of their materials. But what's really a lot more troubling than vagueness is the fact that despite increases in program and policy attention to justice and equity over the last 2 decades, inequity continues to be a major problem in teacher preparation programs, in schools, and in terms of the larger social context in which they're embedded. So I phrase question 2 by borrowing ideas and language from both Nieto and King and building on my little review of equity language in teacher education materials. So if justice and equity are our objectives, how should we be constructing the problem of teacher education for the 2020s? To answer this question, I want to offer a distinction that my colleagues and I have been working on between thin equity and strong equity, because I think it affords some insight. Our distinction builds on the language Benjamin Barber used many years ago. Some of you probably know his work in his classic distinction between thin and strong democracy. In its shortest form, with thin equity, the assumption is that lack of access to teacher quality is the major cause and the major cure for educational inequality. Again, in its shortest form, with strong equity, the assumption is that lack of access to teacher quality is one among many causes of educational inequity, which is produced and reproduced by much larger and long-standing educational and societal inequalities. This means the solution to inequity involves many multidimensional changes in access, systems, and structures in education and in many other areas. Now, I think this distinction is really the clearest if we drill down into the logics behind these two ideas. So here's the chain of reasoning, or what I've been thinking of as the logic map. So behind thin equity, I'm going to start with that one. And we should note here that this is the version of equity that seems to be assumed in many programs and in many policy recommendations about teacher education and teacher quality. So it's not that equity is not there. It's that the version of equity is thin. Here's the logic. Teacher quality is one of the most, if not the most, important school factor in students' achievement. But schools with large numbers of poor and minoritized students are the least likely to have well-qualified teachers. So the teacher quality gap exacerbates the achievement gap and exacerbates inequity. But if we boost and redistribute teacher quality, we can achieve educational equity. So what this means is that thin equity has one dimension: the redistribution of access to teacher quality, because it's assumed that if lack of access to teacher quality is the major cause of inequality, then more and better access is the cure. With thin equity, teacher quality is defined primarily in terms of student achievement. It's assumed that all teachers need to know pretty much the same things, and there's little attention to the cultures of schools and the collective work of teachers with local school communities. There's also the unstated assumption that schools currently operate according to goals and values that everybody shares. This notion of thin equity is powerful because, of course, it's not called thin equity when it's out there in the world. It's just called equity. This means that many teacher preparation programs and policies may appear to address equity, but unless you unpack the logic point by point, it's hard to see that thin equity actually masks the systems and structures, many of them racialized, that sustain inequity. To challenge and rethink the logic of thin equity, my colleagues and I have been working on a different idea: thick or strong equity. So here's its logic. Teacher quality and quality teaching are among many important factors in students' achievement and well-being. But there are systemic disparities in the distribution of teacher quality and other social, economic, and educational resources to communities with large numbers of minoritized students or students living in conditions of poverty. And there are many long-standing school policies, practices, and frames or ways of framing things that have been obstacles to the recognition and representation of the cultures and voices of minoritized groups. This means that teacher education, teachers, and schools alone can't achieve equity or solve the problems of inequity. But teachers, teacher educators, and teacher education programs can and should be active advocates, allies, participants, and partners in much broader equity agendas. In short, you can't get to strong equity just with teacher education, teachers, and schools, but you also can't get there without them. From the strong equity perspective, teacher quality isn't just about teachers who boost student achievement. Teacher quality also includes teachers' capacity to form relationships with students and families that foster well-being, social and emotional development, self-advocacy, and civil skills, as well as teachers' ability to use students and communities' resources as assets. The strong equity perspective also assumes that those most affected by inequity, marginalized and minority groups, have generally not had a voice in deciding what's valued in schools. Unlike thin equity then, which as I said has one dimension, strong equity has four: redistribution, representation, recognition, and reframing. Emily Reagan and I recently represented the four dimensions of strong equity-centered teacher education this way: reframing, which involves widespread rethinking of dominant frames about teaching, learning, and schooling. Frames like colorblindness, meritocracy, best practices, and the idea that the curriculum can be and should be politically neutral. The second dimension is redistribution. Now, this one begins much like the thin equity perspective, calling for the redistribution of teacher quality and quality teaching to all schools and students. But getting to strong equity also requires the redistribution of other social and economic resources. This means we don't simply need better teachers, teacher education programs, and teacher policies to achieve equity. We also need better and different social and economic policies related to healthcare, child poverty, housing, jobs, transportation, safety, early childhood services, and more. The third dimension of strong equity is representation, which means ensuring the authentic inclusion of all relevant stakeholders in teacher education. This includes not just university communities, but also school leaders and teachers, and the families and communities served by the schools that partner with teacher education programs. Finally, the fourth dimension of strong equity is recognition, which involves regarding as assets, not deficits, the cultural values, experience, and knowledge traditions of minoritized students, families, and communities in the teacher education curriculum and in the K-12 curriculum. All of this means that constructing teacher education as a strong equity problem is not simply stating that equity is a goal, but also baking equity in to all the aspects of practice and policy in our everyday work. Contexts. What are some examples? What can we learn from them? So in the remainder of the time this morning, I want to describe some examples of what it looks like when strong equity is the overarching goal. Education. That is what it looks like not to have equity just as one of the many boxes we tick off as we do our work, but to lead with equity. What it looks like not to assume equity will come along as a sort of byproduct if we hire the right teachers or if we get the right accountability policies in place. Here, I note that although teacher education work that's centered in strong equity is increasing, this kind of work has definitely not been the norm, even if the language of equity and justice has been used. even if on the surface, projects seem to aim for equity. So what comes next is, I hope, the inspirational part of the talk. And you'll see that I've chosen here to say a little bit about a lot of examples rather than a lot about a few. And here again, the reference list that will be available to all of you provides many sources about these examples. All of them have, but one, I think, have been written about so that you can get more detail about this work. So I'm thinking of strong equity work in teacher education broadly in terms of programs and projects, tools and frameworks, critiques, reviews, and theory practice models, and state and local policies. And a reminder here again, this is not a comprehensive list. Even though strong equity-centered teacher education is not the norm, there are many other examples, including, I think, some of the work that many of you are doing here. So first, some examples of strong equity-centered programs and projects. At Ball State University, which is a primarily white institution, a predominantly white institution in Muncie, Indiana, the schools within the context of community program is a community embedded undergraduate program for elementary and early childhood teacher candidates. And it's intentionally located and in an historically Black neighborhood in Muncie. To prepare culturally responsive and community sustaining educators, the program has community members who collaborate with university faculty to co-teach courses, to interview prospective teacher candidates, to mentor and assess teacher candidates, to participate in accreditation visits, and to serve on university committees. So they really become co-teacher educators. UCLA's Center X K-12 teacher preparation program has been around for a long time. It places groups of student teachers in the most vulnerable schools in the LA area. Teacher candidates are taught activist skills in working with immigrant families and other minoritized communities, including those who speak Black English. And they're taught directly how to use asset-based frameworks for instruction and assessment of students. The program is evaluated partly according to their graduates' retention in urban public schools and communities. Western Washington University's early childhood education program reflects the state's mandate on Native American education. The program takes up land education approaches, along with critical and decolonizing theories to disrupt the settler colonial curriculum. Faculty have integrated their social justice mission into course syllabi, into teacher candidates' learning opportunities and assessments, including a field-based critical literacy course situated in a tribal nation early learning center working with Indigenous teachers. Now, here's one more example of a program or project, and this is from Australia. And I'm using an example from Australia because I want to make the point that equity-centered teacher education is an international endeavor. It looks different in different places, but it's not something that only people here are concerned about. This example also makes the case that sometimes these kinds of programs and projects can be scaled up. So the National Exceptional Teaching for Disadvantaged Schools program, NETDS, the founders told me once they really regretted that mouthful of a label, but that's what it was called. So this began at Queensland's University of Technology, partly in response to the efforts of Teach for Australia to recruit top college grads to teach in high-need Australian schools, but only for a short time and with little preparation. Now, I'm guessing that might sound familiar since this is the Australian version of Teach for America. Note the thin equity logic underlying the Teach for Australia program. Inequity is assumed to be caused by the unfair distribution of good teachers. So getting smart college students to work for a short term in high need areas is assumed to be the cure that will lead to equity. The NETDS program rejected that logic. Instead, they started recruiting their own top performing education students to make a long-term commitment to work alongside teachers and families in very high poverty communities in rural Australia. But before they entered those communities, the teacher candidates had extensive coursework that helped them understand the structures, systems, and conditions that caused and sustained poverty in rural Australia. Eventually, this program scaled up to more than 7 universities, and they got funding from the state to do it because they could show that their graduates stayed in teaching and that they were effective at working with communities in poverty. When one of the program founders moved to La Trobe University in Melbourne, she founded the similar Nexus program there. Now, my second group of examples includes tools and frameworks. Some of you may be familiar with the Education Deans for Justice and Equity organization, or EDGE. This is an organization that was spearheaded by Kevin Kumashiro, Kathy Schultz, and others that you may know. EDGE now has about 250 deans and department chairs as members. As a group, they developed what they called the Framework for Assessment and Transformation. Actually, they called it the EDGE Framework for Assessment and Transformation. And it centers on equity and justice in all of the tasks that teacher education programs have to do, or that education departments and even whole schools of education have to do. The framework, and this is being used in multiple programs and schools of ed across the country, although I think it had a bit of a setback during COVID, but everything did. This framework explicitly recognizes, and it's based on the idea that no educational institutions are neutral politically or ideologically. So part of the idea is to get those programs to look at themselves and to try to figure out what their political and ideological assumptions are, even if they may not be stated. The framework helps leaders, faculty, and staff raise hard questions about the many tasks they do, including tasks related to teaching and learning, to be sure, but also including tasks related to things like budgeting and figuring out funding rationales and asking questions about how funding and financing decisions are shaped by neoliberal or other trends. The Framework for Equitable and Excellent Teaching, or FEAT, was developed by Maria Salazar at the University of Denver. This is a classroom observation protocol that they use with teachers and with teacher candidates. The basic premise of this is to reject widely used models of teacher evaluation because they are, as Salazar puts it, centered in dominant white culture. Instead, this framework, this observation protocol, draws very explicitly on the values of minoritized communities by focusing on equity language and concepts during planning, during classroom interaction, and assessment of students. And finally, at my own university, we developed a 12-item Learning to Teach for Social Justice belief scale, which is now used yearly as part of a suite of surveys given to all teacher candidates across programs. We've used the social justice scale over many years now to explore whether teacher candidates' scores changed from program entry to program exit. But we've also looked at whether any positive changes that they had from entry to exit were actually maintained after graduation once they were in the schools. We've also looked across years at the patterns we could see in teacher candidates' responses, the ideas that they found the most difficult to get their heads around. And we used our analysis to inform curriculum and program revisions over time. The third area of strong equity-centered teacher education includes this kind of a little bit of a mishmash of a category that I'm calling critiques, reviews, and theory practice models. Just a few months ago, and some of you I'm sure have seen this, Gist and Bristol published their co-edited Handbook of Research on Teachers of Color and Indigenous Teachers, which focuses on ethno-racial teacher diversity and focuses on disrupting traditional power relationships in research. This handbook was partly a response to trying to the fact that so many other handbooks implicitly assume a sort of white mainstream base and don't necessarily focus on other groups. So this handbook has 75 reviews and more than 1,100 pages. So it is a very fat tome. The authors and the section editors, primarily people of color or indigenous, analyze what the research says about supports, obstacles, and strategies for enhancing the recruitment, the quality of experiences, and the retention of teachers of color and indigenous teachers in initial and continuing teacher education. A second example is Price Dennis and Celie Ruiz, Advancing Racial Literacies in Teacher Education, Activism for Equity in Digital Spaces. This is just one example, but this is a book length argument. I find it pretty compelling, and a framework for centering racial literacies in teacher education. They define racial literacy as the ability to probe the existence, roots, and effects of racism and to counter those. The authors argue that teacher education needs to privilege interdisciplinary discussions of race and education and promote activism in what are increasingly powerful digital spaces. Obviously, it's a much more complicated argument than I can offer here. It's worth looking at, I think. Third, there are a number of analyses that singly and collectively have exposed the white culture, values, and knowledge traditions historically at the center of many teacher education programs, their curriculum, their practices, the way they establish field placements, and the tools that they use for assessment. Some of these scholars have argued that some programs and practices intended to improve teacher education actually circumscribe the possibilities for minoritized students and relegate justice and equity to the periphery. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to give any details about these examples, but again, all of them are on that reference list, and I highly recommend you're reading some of that work. Finally, here are a few examples of state policymakers working to build equity-centered evaluation of teacher education. And I have to remind you, this is not the norm in terms of how state policies are established. So Emily Reagan and I had to really look to find examples of state policy. And none of these are perfect, but these are people who I think are working in the right direction. So working from the perspective of structural racism, the Consortium for Research-Based and Equitable Assessments, or CREA, and this is led by Leslie Fenwick, who has been working at AACTE as a former dean for a number of years. So this is a group of teacher educators from 14 institutions who are working with state policymakers to reduce discriminatory state-required entrance exam barriers to teacher education. And part of their point is to increase the diversity of the teacher workforce. Here's another example from my state, led by Claire Abbott. The Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education is in the process of updating its teacher preparation program approval guidelines to assess what, how, and how much teacher candidates learn about anti-racist practices in their teacher preparation programs. As part of this, the state will eventually require programs to demonstrate equity in outcomes and to show how they're breaking historical patterns of racial inequity, not by accident, but by design. So you can imagine this is a long time project. And third, under the leadership of Tony Rosalise, the Oregon Teacher Standards and Practices Commission of the Oregon Department of Education has recently implemented multiple measures options beyond just teacher tests to assess teacher candidates' content knowledge. And the point, like the point of the CREA project I mentioned first, the point is to reduce barriers to entry into teaching, particularly for teachers of color and teachers from minoritized communities. And again, I do want to make the point, this is not the norm. This is not what most state policies are doing. But I hope that these brief examples that cover programs, policy, frameworks and tools, and critiques, I hope that those examples might have been inspirational in terms of what you're thinking about with your own work. So as I near my conclusion, I'd like to invite all of us to think for a few minutes about our own programs and our projects and our initiatives and frameworks and collaboratives and partnerships and local policies in terms of these 4 dimensions of strong equity. I'd like to ask us to think about how do these 4 dimensions apply to our own work and to other research and practice work in education generally, and in teacher education, in professional development, in leadership, in whatever area you're in. Are some of these dimensions missing from our work? Are some of them really underplayed? I'm going to offer a few questions that I think might guide our reflections as we distinguish thin and strong equity, and as we unpack the logic maps and assumptions of our own work. So here are my suggestions for some questions. Where, how, and how often do the words equity or justice appear in our materials? I'm thinking of things like websites, program documents, standards, syllabi, mission statements, research articles, school documents. Is equity defined in our materials? What's the underlying equity logic map of our own work? How is equity positioned in our work? Is it central or is it peripheral? Is it assumed to be a byproduct of high standards or strong accountability? What is assumed to be the role of various actors in achieving educational equity, including teachers, teacher candidates, teacher educators, school-based educators, researchers, evaluators, policymakers, community members? In other words, whose job is equity? Do we consider unequal outcomes and unequal opportunities the responsibility of the system and try to understand how that system works? Or do we tend to blame individual actors and groups? Are all those with a genuine stake in our work authentically represented at all phases of the work, from goal setting to planning to evidence generation, decision-making, and evaluation? Do our projects acknowledge and address power issues, and incorporate approaches that are intentionally designed to share power? And finally, does our work recognize the perspectives, knowledge sources, and experiences of those most affected by the root causes of inequity, especially parents, families, and community members from minoritized communities? I want to close with a final few words of what I hope might be inspiration. And so to do that, I'm going to offer a poem by Bruno Overstreet. It's a simple poem, but I think it speaks to what often seems like the daunting task of trying to develop strong, equity-centered teacher education, and also speaks perhaps to our own self-doubts about the capacity of our own bounded efforts to make a difference. For me, this poem inspires because it acknowledges the limits, but also the power and possibilities of our work in our own spheres of influence. You say the little efforts that I make will do no good to tip the hovering scale where justice hangs in balance. I do not think I ever thought they would. But I am prejudiced beyond debate in favor of my right to choose which side shall feel the stubborn ounces of my weight. Thank you. And now I think we have opportunity for questions. I thought I would come down here. If anybody has a question. Do you have a question? Good.
Hello, and thank
Hello.
you. I don't know if this mic is on. Is it on?
I think it
Okay,
is.
all right. So I really appreciate your work. Thank you so much for speaking with us. And I was really interested in the historical background that you provided. And I noticed that each of these it's an era that came and went, and it went because of the problems that it had. So I'm wondering if you could share with us your thoughts on how to keep this from being another era that comes and goes, and how we can accomplish an equity objective while not neglecting what we've learned from the technical era, from the teacher learning era, from curriculum, and from policy.
You really paid good attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I took notes.
Actually, those eras come and go, but they don't really go. And so you probably noticed that some of those issues recur, like the whole is learning to teach a technical thing that we have to do just in the schools and it's practical, or is it about how teachers think about their work, the intellectual aspects? That was central for a while and then went away for a while, but it didn't really go. We hear those same kinds of issues again and again. And I think it's important to remember that history and learn from it, as you are wanting to do, but also realize that when those themes and topics recur, they recur in a new historical context. So it's never just the same, but things do come back around. In terms of equity and how do we make this not the equity era that will come and go? First of all, I would be thrilled if we ever made it the equity era. That's not the dominant way, I don't think, that people are constructing the problem of teacher education right now. So I think it would be wonderful if we could 25 years from now look back and say, boy, that was the equity era. The goal would be we wouldn't have to have equity again and again and again because we'd achieve it. I think that will not happen. So but I do think you're right that there are things that of course we learn from the training focus, from the learning focus, and even from the policy focus. And policy is not a bad thing. It has to do with what policies are about. My argument here, or my hope here, is that we make equity an aspect of every one of those things all the time, so that we're always thinking about equity issues as we also focus on learning. I think right now, in a lot of places, and whether that applies here, I don't know. I don't know the work here well enough to say, but in a lot of places, I do think people have a checklist of things that they do as they're writing an article or preparing a grant proposal or working on a new course in teacher education. And equity is one of the things they check off. Now, maybe not actually, but it's kind of, oh yeah, did we think about equity? Oh yeah, we did that. And what I'm suggesting is it can't just be one of those things that we check off. Oh, we did that in the diversity course. We did that in the equity course. We don't have to think about that anymore. That this has to be, I like to call it an umbrella idea, or a guiding idea that cuts across all of them. So maybe we can meet again in 20 years and look back and see what has happened. I must say I'm concerned about many things, and I don't think as a country we are really going in the direction of working for strong equity teaching or teacher education in the way that I think we need to do. But thanks for your question.
Howdy, I'm Patrick Slattery. I'm in philosophy of education. And I love your inspirational citations and the references. I've been at this 50 years. And teacher education, early 70s, I had a great program. I was thinking of that when looking at the history. In my volunteer work and in my personal life, I'm immersed in the issue, one of the issues there that I think really is most important. And while I don't research this, I know it from the inside, and that's the mental health issue. And I'm thinking of 4 things. I'll try to keep this short. Number 1, hospitals. The report in the New York Times yesterday of all the closures in Mississippi of the hospitals. Number 2, mental health facilities don't exist in many counties in this state, including some just south of us. I ride with the constable of Houston often, and he tells me the largest mental health institution is in their jail. And we don't have investment there. Number 3, child abuse. And I do know sheriffs and district attorneys who tell me that the number 1 case they deal with is child abuse. And then these kids end up in the school with our teacher ed students who aren't really prepared in that area. I did an intervention here in College Station about 7 years ago in a trailer park. And the 4th thing that I want to say is fentanyl and meth. All the adults, maybe they were parents or not, were strung out, and there were kids running around in diapers and naked. And I went with social workers, and I almost wanted to cry when I think about walking into those trailer parks, rescuing kids, school-age kids. And then number 2, I spent my day yesterday, all day, in a homeless encampment in this area. It's about 50 miles south of us in the woods, and they have kids, and they have about 500 people. Most people don't know it. They call it the gypsies, and they're ignored. I play chess with the kids. I work with it. This is volunteer work. My point, the mental health thing, if we don't look at hospitals, mental health, fentanyl, then all the teacher training we do, all the education we have out in the school, right now, we're in desperate straits, and I see it firsthand. Thank you for letting me say that. And I'm sure you're going to expand on it because, you know, it was there, but there's so much more.
Thank you. I'm not sure what the actual question was, but I certainly agree with you that mental health issues are critical. I also agree with you that we probably don't do a very good job of preparing teachers to deal with those issues because there are so many issues and so many things for teachers to be prepared to do. In Boston, a number of my colleagues talk about in the Boston Public Schools, they want new teachers who can who are prepared to work with students who've been involved in trauma. And so they use the phrase trauma a lot, which is not exactly what you're talking about, but certainly related. I think that in teacher education, the example from Australia, where they were preparing people to go and work with kids and families and communities in the poorest parts of rural Australia. And part of what they were teaching them, as I said in that example, before they went, was what causes poverty? What sustains poverty here? What are the conditions in which these people are living? Because young teacher candidates, sometimes quite young, are often or rarely prepared to understand that. And from their perspective, it can look like, well, parents aren't being responsible or they're not doing what they ought to do. So I think we absolutely need to work on many of these issues. And I think part of it is, what are we preparing teachers for? In that program, they were preparing those teachers specifically to go into those rural, poor areas of Australia. So I think one promising practice in teacher education are context-specific teacher preparation programs. So you're not trying to prepare teachers for every location, for every context, for everything. You're trying to prepare them for particular things. Now, some people will argue against that. I'm not going to go into that argument, but I think that's one way to try to think about some of these very tough challenges that face us today.
Hi there. My name is Julie Thompson. I'm an assistant professor of special education here at the university. And I'm a passionate person, and sometimes that passion can get me in trouble. I teach a class called Emotional and Behavioral Disorders in special education. Even the title of the class bothers me because I think that it's systems and organizations that create what is considered an emotional behavior disorder, and all the issues with disproportionality of Black and Latinx males in particular in being punished and that sort of thing. So I teach about disproportionality in my classroom, but I do it shaking and a little scared, like I am feeling nervous right now. I'm standing here talking to you because of the political climate. And I suppose what my question for you is, how do we support our teachers? How do we embed this passion for social justice and for equity without setting them up for a lot of difficulty, even maintaining their jobs in the climate that we're in right now?
It's a good question. It's a hard question. Many, many years ago, I wrote an article called Learning to Teach Against the Grain. Some of you who are my age might remember it. And I think what we're still trying to do, didn't know where you went. You're back there now. Okay. I think many of us who are passionate and who have really strong moral and ethical and political ideological commitments are trying to prepare people to teach against the grain. But the grain now is very different from the grain I was writing about in that article. So one thing I think we have to do is keep that in mind as we're working on a new course, or as you're revising the course that you do now. I think we have to think about those things. I also think, though, that in our partnerships with schools, part of what we want teacher candidates to have the opportunity to do is to learn to teach against the grain in the company of teachers who are already trying to do that. So I think we want not to set people up in the university, go out because all that stuff they're doing in the schools is wrong and you should go out there and change it. But we want to find partners, because my experience over many years has been that there are people in the schools, teachers and school leaders, who are trying to do this work, maybe not exactly the same way that you or I are trying to do it, but who are trying to do this work. And our teacher candidates can learn from them because they understand that local context in ways that we don't. So I think this is another thing that we don't do very much in teacher education. We don't help teacher candidates think about learning from the practitioners and the communities they're going to be going into beyond just these practices that we want you to engage in. So I think you're right. It's on us if we just set people up to go out in the schools and then fail or get in trouble for what they're saying. But I think we can help them understand the conditions, understand the context, and think about what they're trying to do, and then work with other people who are in those contexts, who are also and already trying to do those things. I don't know if that exactly answers your question. Great, thank you. Oh. Nice to meet you.
My wife, Sue, and I are probably the two individuals in here that don't have a PhD by our name, so please excuse us, okay? Though I did have about 200 plus hours, I just couldn't turn that into a PhD. I'm an engineer, and I graduated here from our Mays Business School. So the first thing that, by the way, I really enjoyed your talk. My wife and I did.
Thank you.
Learned an awful lot. First thing I want to read is when it comes to state spending on education, Texas trails the national average by over 4,000 per student, earning our state an F rating and ranking 42nd in the nation in per student spending. The impact of underfunding our public schools is long lasting. That's a very profound one sentence, isn't it?
It is.
Hope we didn't disappoint you too much being from Massachusetts, but that's the facts. You know, education is one of our most valuable assets that we have in our country, the opportunity for it. And it's one of the most important assets for an individual and is also the core values, selfless service, respect, integrity, loyalty, things that we promote here at A&M, that all these, this education to me needs to be defined as including all types of education. And it should be also include those of core values like leadership and teamwork. So I'm just kind of defining what is education. I'm an engineer, so we always said, what's the given? And that's what I'm trying to establish. And what's the required? Well, if education is one of our most valuable assets, then we need to treat it like such, in my opinion, as a society. We have an education problem. That's obvious, right? You've presented a lot of the problems. And in life, I found in my business career that if you find problems when they're solved, and I always tell my employees or managers says, you got a problem, it's okay, just share it and we'll try to solve it, because it's easier to solve problems when they're small. They take small answers. When you let them get big, they take big answers. And I think you made it clear, we have a lot of big problems and therefore they take big answers. And we really need to get back to where, how do we solve these big problems, but how do we start doing things so we turn them into small problems that require small answers. And then just a couple points that I found. In Texas, you may or may not know that we had record teacher resignations the last 2 years, record. And why? I'm not sure why. Was it teacher pay? Was it safety? Was it their job satisfaction? But we had record resignations across Texas. Next point. We have recruited for 31 years National Merit Scholars as well as disadvantaged students here at A&M. And we have found that the difference or the spread of academic curriculum between the highest level educations and those of the lower has spread significantly. It used to be 10 years ago, the number of AP credits of a National Merit Scholar were 2 to 3 AP credits, which is 6 to 9 credit hours here at A&M. Now it's averaging 15 and we have them up to 20. And I'm not talking about 5 or 10 or 15, but I'm talking about 300 students that apply. And, you know, that turns into, what is 20 times 3 is 60 college credit hours. So the spread we're finding between the schools where the students have the opportunity, whether they're private or public, and those at the lower, I mean, the width is expanding dramatically in just the last 10 years. The other thing that we've noticed or that we found is that education, we think, should be defined very clearly to people. And that is, it's not becoming a lawyer, becoming a doctor, or an engineer. It really should be about all types of ways that you can be productive in life. It might be someone that goes overseas and volunteers, Red Cross and so on. It could be someone that is one of those professions. It could be electricians, plumbers. And I think that we need to, what we usually look at it, I do as an engineer is state what the given is. What are the facts and what's required? And the required is this. The statement simply was education is one of our most valuable assets we give besides health and safety. And if it is one of your most valuable assets that we as a government and people can give to people, then we should really work on it and do something about it. So do you agree?
I do agree. I do agree. I can't remember all the different points you said, but let me just say a couple of things in response. One is teacher shortages we're going to talk about tonight in the other event with Gloria Latson-Billings and Cheryl Craig and myself. So we'll hold the comments, I think, on shortages, which is absolutely a problem in many, many places, not just Texas, but here as well. I think that's one thing. Another thing is, I think people like you who are not educators, who are not in this field per se, I think I got that right? I think that's a big part of what it will take to solve a lot of these problems, is people who are not teachers or not professors in ed schools or not in the schools who care about public education coming together and trying to address these problems from different perspectives, not by blaming schools, well, you're not doing a good job, but by working together to share their perspectives. So I think that's an important thing. The idea of the growing disparities in opportunities between those who have those opportunities and those who don't, that I think you were making that point with the part about the AP credits. That is exactly what I've been talking about. These disparities have grown. Income inequality in this country has grown. So, I mean, I think you touched on many, many important issues, and that's why we need to make our focus in teaching and teacher education, I think, equity. Make that the focus at the top all along in every area. So thank you for your comments, and I think.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you so very, very much. We are indeed privileged at Texas A&M to have these kinds of discussions and forums. Before we conclude this afternoon, I would like to please ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Marilyn Cochran-Smith one more time. I'd also like us to think deeply about the challenges that were put before us. Perhaps in the true Aggie tradition, maybe we need to look at this differently. Dr. Slattery brought up issues of the Health Science Center in our School of Medicine. Topics were brought up that addressed our Bush School of Public Policy. Certainly the School of Education and Human Development and its importance. Business impacts that are addressed from our Mays Business School. nutrition, quality of life, from agri-life, engineering, arts and sciences. Perhaps we are challenged this morning and this afternoon to look at teacher education very differently. And as Aggies, we have the opportunity to really change the narrative around this topic. We have the resources around us, and we have the support around us. And as you always hear from me, we need to get after this, and we need to get after this now. Get after what? Well, at 5 p.m. today, right here in this Zone Club, we are going to have not only Marilyn Cochran-Smith, but another giant in our world of education, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, take this stage in a fireside chat, and they're going to really tell you what they think about this topic. But in anticipation of this evening's event and reception, Marilyn, I want to thank you. We were deeply touched by your talk today. Your research, insights, and the critical topics you touched with our audience were right on point. I also want to give thanks again to those who were here and attended our lecture in person and via live stream. If you want to hear more, once again, we will be here in the Club Zone today at 5 p.m., joined by our Hagler Fellow, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. Gloria is a current fellow of the Hagler Institute for Advanced Study at Texas A&M University. The two will share their perspectives on navigating K-12 education in a 1-hour conversation moderated by our own Dr. Cheryl Craig. We hope to see each of you. We invite you, invite your friends, now that you've experienced something very powerful. We invite you to come back later today to join us in what universities do best, and that is a time of open dialogue, okay, of frank discussions and spurring ideas to solve wicked problems. These are wicked problems. These are intolerable problems. Craig, you're an engineer, and if an engineering problem was this messy, it would almost be intolerable. And so please plan to join us. It has been an invigorating morning. And from all of us, on behalf of the faculty, the staff, our administration, President Banks, we thank you for joining us at Texas A&M University in the Zone Club right here at Kyle Field. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon.